Here at the Seattle Atheist Church, the members ourselves give many of the talks. But today, it's my honor to introduce you to a very special guest speaker. Phil Zuckerman is a professor of sociology and secular studies at Pitzer College in Claremont, California. In 2011, Phil founded the first secular studies department in the nation. A little over a year ago, Phil had just published his latest book, What It Means to Be Moral: Why Religion is Not Necessary for Living an Ethical Life. And a bunch of us got to see him speak at Third Place Books in Ravenna, here in Seattle. That was a stimulating presentation and discussion, and I highly recommend the book. It's truly a tour de force on the topic. Phil is the author of several other books as well, including Living the Secular Life and Society Without God, and he writes a regular blog for Psychology Today titled The Secular Life. Though Dr. Zuckerman does need to leave us early today for a family obligation, there will be time for Q&A. So please have your questions ready, and please make sure they end with a question mark. So now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Phil Zuckerman.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Wow, thank you. What an awesome turnout. I'm really impressed. I'm so grateful you guys exist. I'm so grateful you're out there, you're together, you found each other. Loved the intro, the philosophy of your endeavor. It's just spot on. Let's see. Yeah, okay, so we'll just get started. I'm zooming to you right now from Claremont, California. It's in Southern California near Pasadena. And I grew up about 50 miles west, right on the beach in LA. It's a little town called Pacific Palisades. It's in between Malibu and Santa Monica. And I am a third generation non-believer, a third generation atheist. All four of my grandparents were secular of different varieties. So my mom's parents, who were from Bohemia, were sort of agnostic, indifferent, more interested in literature, music, film, things, skiing and hiking. Didn't have any interest in God, but certainly weren't engaged in that debate at all. My father's parents, who were from Poland, were actually committed atheists. They were socialist, democratic socialists. All four were Jews, so everybody had to leave, and luckily we were able to get out before the Nazis took over and came to the United States. But so I have, and then my parents, my mom's indifferent and agnostic, my dad's a hardcore atheist, and then there's me. And we grew up in the Palisades in a very non-religious nook. I was born in 1969. I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and it was quite secular. And by that, I mean, none of the kids I knew ever went to church. Sunday mornings were just a normal Sunday morning, other than there was no good cartoons on TV. And I do remember the air raids would ring for about an hour every day, which I remember asking my dad, what's that? And he's like, well, that's what they'll do if the Russians, send nuclear bombs our way. And I was like, well, what are we supposed to do if we hear that? And he was like, nothing, because we're all going to die. And I'm like, well, that's nice. No, he didn't say that, but what could he say? Otherwise, none of my teachers ever talked about Jesus or, going on a missionary trip over Easter break. None of my soccer or baseball games started with a prayer. In fact, religion was quite marginal and minimal, other than in a maybe cultural way. So there was a Jewish community where I grew up, and I went to Yiddish school, which was about learning language and culture and heritage, never about God. I also went to a Reconstructionist synagogue, which also everybody was a non-believer, but it was a lot of culture. I also attended an Episcopalian summer camp. I did have to learn to say the Lord's Prayer, but the rest of the day was water fights and capture the flag. So anyway, the point was that, religion, it wasn't that it didn't exist, but it certainly wasn't a faith-based phenomena anywhere. So that's kind of how I grew up. And I really only took religion seriously when I was in high school. And my first serious girlfriend was a daughter of a non-denominational evangelical pastor and was born again. And she was born again, although you wouldn't know it from her lifestyle. But that was when I first was like, what? People really believe this? I kind of thought these beliefs died out, in Salem in the 1600s or something. Like, I was sort of stunned to meet living, breathing people who actually believed what seemed to me so absurd. I mean, I'd be more likely to believe in Omar the Purple Weasel, living on Neptune or something. I was just like, anyway. So that got me really, fascinated in religion and starting to take it seriously. So fast forward to college, graduate school, I was studying religion. And, if you want to study religion, you got, 1,000 lifetimes ahead of you. There's so much out there. There is so much to study. You can study the history of religion. You can study the philosophy of religion. You can study the sociology of religion. You can study religion anthropologically. You can study religion neurologically, psychologically. In fact, almost every discipline, even economics, they all have huge traditions of studying religion. And what I mean by traditions is their founding theorists wrote a lot about it. So the founders of anthropology, most of what they were writing was about religion. Even the founders of sociology, Weber, Durkheim, Du Bois, Marx, they wrote a lot. Gilman, they wrote a lot about religion. The founders of psychology, from William James to Freud to you name it. Religion seemed to be a topic of interest to so many historians. Religion's been such a big part of their endeavor. There's journals devoted to every aspect, the neuropsychology of religious beliefs, religious music, religious food, religious dance. In other words, religion is a kind of transdisciplinary feast. And that's a good thing. It should be. Religion has been a huge part of civilizations since we started keeping track of these things. And we need to get a handle on it. We need to understand it and see how it intersects with our world. And so I'm more than happy that these journals exist, these departments exist, these societies for the scientific study of religion exist, the American Academy of Religion, and on and on and on. It's great stuff. And I was heavily involved in it as a young professor, early scholar in grad school. So all the conferences I went to were religious studies conferences of one stripe or another. However, little revolver this morning. However, the final track, Tomorrow Never Knows, inaugurated the psychedelic era, in my opinion. Okay. That maybe them's fighting words for you in Seattle. Maybe you think it was 13th floor elevators from Austin. I don't think so. Anyway, here's the deal. I majored in sociology. That's where I got my degrees at the University of Oregon in Eugene, my favorite city. And the whole idea of the social sciences, whether it's sociology, psychology, linguistics, political science, anthropology, criminology, whatever it is, my understanding is it's an attempt to try to understand human beings. Like, why do they do what they do? Think what they think, believe what they believe, eat what they eat, love what they love, screw what they screw. Like, it's all about trying to figure out humans from different perspectives. And, if you're fascinated by humans, then social science is the place to go. However, it's dawned on several of us that a huge chunk of humanity is secular or non-religious. We can talk about terminology. I'm sure we'll get to that. Of varying shades and hues and categories. And that chunk has been growing exponentially in the 20th century. It's been exploding in the last 50 years, so that for the first time in recorded human history, we now have societies where there are more non-believers than believers. So, for example, Scotland now has more non-believers. Czech Republic has more non-believers. Estonia has more non-believers. Japan has more non-believers. South Korea. Places and other places, you're seeing 20, 30, 40%. Even places, obviously Western Europe, Canada, Scandinavia, but also in Australia, New Zealand, but also in South America. Places like Uruguay, Chile, Argentina are seeing their non-religious populations exploding. And of course, the United States of America, right? The 9th best country in the world. Go USA. Now, the USA was always held up when I was in grad school as the great exception to secularization. Okay, maybe Europe is secularizing, and maybe Australia, New Zealand, and so on and so forth, and some democracies in Asia. But the United States, hey, this modern, wealthy, industrialized nation is very religious, just as religious as El Salvador, et cetera, et cetera. Well, not so. We have seen this rise of the nuns that has taken place in my lifetime, where now we have upwards of 30% of Americans who are non-religious. They're not all atheists or agnostics, but anyway, the point is, about 15 years ago, some of us started recognizing this. And this gets to the heart of social science. If the goal of social science is to study humanity, well, academia is missing a big chunk and a growing chunk. Academia is not speaking directly to the huge chunk of humanity who grew up in secular culture, in secular families, or in secular societies, or are secular themselves, but they're in the thick of some Bible thumping community in Alabama. But who are they? How are their lives lived? Why do they not believe? How do their brains work? So we started to meet at these religious studies conferences, and we'd kind of cluster together, and we'd maybe have a little panel on humanism or atheism or agnosticism or something. And it became quickly apparent to all of us that there was a big lacuna, a big gap here in academia. Hence the drive to start secular studies. And the first, I think, big development institutionally was at Trinity College, of all places, not in Ireland, but in Connecticut, with under Barry Cosman and Ariella Kazar. They got some funding to start a research institute. It was called the Institute for the Study of Secularism in Society and Culture. They didn't bestow any diplomas or degrees, but they had some funding to do like the ARS study and various studies around secularity and secularism. Then we founded at Pitzer College the Secular Studies Department. So students can actually take classes in secular studies and actually graduate with a degree, a bachelor's degree in secular studies. There are now 2 journals, a secular studies journal. There's also Journal of Non-Religion and Secularism that are peer reviewed and online and available. There's been a wonderful development in the UK, the Non-Religion and Secularity Research Network, headed by Lois Lee and Steve Boulevant and a few others, that has created annual conferences where we present our research just like any others. So this field has exploded and it's really exciting. And I'll just give you a quick sense of what we're trying to do. So we're basically looking at, from the social science perspective, how does secularity and secularism play itself out in the political realm? And you can't understand the United States or India or Turkey or Israel or Nepal if you don't understand secularism, right? In part of that political process, and so many other places as well. From a psychological perspective, we want to understand the minds and personalities of secular people. Are they different than religious people? If so, how, why? What are their proclivities psychologically, their personalities? From a sociological perspective, we're interested in secular movements, secular groups, how secular people live their lives, how secularity intersects with other variables like race, class, gender, sexuality. From an anthropological perspective, we're interested in secular culture. What does it look like? What are its manifestations? And then, of course, from a historical perspective, the history of secularity and secular people and atheists and agnostics. It's an untold story. It's deep, it's rich, it's there. It just hasn't been plumbed to the degree it ought to, and that's now changing. From a humanities perspective, how does secularity express itself through literature, through film, through visual arts, through dance? Is there an atheistic aesthetic? Things like that. And I could go on and on. So that's secular studies. We're trying to generate research, share research, generate a better understanding of the role of secularity and secularism in society and culture, past and present. Whoo! I will now stop rambling at you. I hope that wasn't too fast. And now let's take some questions.